session is about money, specifically your view of money versus your local elected officials' view of money, your library's view of money versus your local government's view. But wait, money's money, right? Wrong. Actually, money is all about perspective. Different people can see things very differently based upon their perspective. And to start changing your perspective, let me give you a statement that changed mine a number of years ago. This is by Robert Kiyosaki, New York Times bestselling author of Rich Dad Poor Dad, where he said, money is only what you agree it is. Money's only what you agree it is. So let me give you an example of that in real life. Let's say that you're driving your car and you look down and realize that you've got a little over a quarter tank of gas. So you probably should fill up. You pull into a gas station, but you realize the gas is about $3.50. And you think to yourself, I really should fill up, but that's too expensive. So you leave that gas station, you continue to drive, and you realize very quickly you've made a very big mistake. There are no gas stations anywhere in sight, and you continue to drive for miles without seeing any. And now you're on E. The light comes on, it dings, your blood pressure goes up. You continue to drive along, hoping to see a gas station, praying to see a gas station, and off in the distance, you do. And you feel this tremendous sense of relief because you're going to make it. You're not going to be stranded. But when you pull in, you find the gas there is $6 a gallon. But guess what? It doesn't matter at that point. You desperately need the gas. It doesn't matter what they're charging. You see, perspective changes things. Money is only what you agree it is. At a quarter tank of gas, you don't agree that $3.50 is a good bargain for a gallon of gas. But when you're on E, running the risk of being stranded, $6 is a bargain. Money is only what you agree it is a great first step for you to start changing your personal perspective of money. So as we start this session, recognize we're just going to dig into this idea of perspective. That the library has a very different perspective of money than your local government does. And that's where so much of your friction and miscommunication may come in. So let's talk about perspective and what makes up perspective. What are the questions you should be asking yourself to gain a better understanding? First, ask yourself, who is the institution you're thinking of? Is it your library or is it local government? So when you start thinking about money, it's not all the same. So if you're thinking about money within your library, that is a very different thought process than within your local government. And that's a way to start to see the difference is to see what is the stated mission of each organization, each institution. The library certainly has a mission. It has bylaws that it operates under, but a local government has a charter and reams of local laws, local ordinances that it has to abide by law. Another question is, how do you define the words financial stewardship? How do you define them as a library versus your local government? I mean, as a library, financial stewardship generally begins with your compensating rate, what the percent is, how much that brings in. You then build a budget that you stay within to provide a menu of services for your community. You put some of that money away in a rainy day fund to save up to hopefully build a building or more facilities later without having to go into debt. That is not how local government views money. They start with what is this year's budget. They think 1 year at a time, and that's their time horizon. It always is their time horizon. They think about that yearly budget through the lens of all the ordinances that tell them what they have to provide services for by law, how much money they can take in, where they can spend it. They have all these rules that tell them what they can do with that. And they have to spend that over things like public safety, police, fire, corrections, code enforcement, building inspection, things like sanitation and roads, parks and rec, and sewers. By law, they have to cover all of these areas, and they're thinking 1 year at a time, how much money can we take in and how much money has to go out? Their definition of financial stewardship is wildly different than yours. Okay. As a part of that, you have to start thinking about what are the governing laws, bylaws, policies of the institution. See, with them, local government, they have all these laws that tell them what they can and can't do in every area. Whereas you may have a lot more flexibility because you just don't have the volume of rules to follow. What is the budget and what can it be spent on? Huge questions. This is where so much of your friction is being generated. Let me show you. First, you want to think about the size of the annual budget you're working with. Your annual budget size is very different than your local government size. With size comes all kinds of different challenges, opportunities, and complexities. The bigger issue, though, is where can the money be spent? When you take a dollar in, it has to go to a certain bucket in some cases, and only that bucket. And that can create huge friction points. Huge friction points for you. Big areas of miscommunication happen right here. Let me give you an example that I personally experienced when I was a city council member for the city of Lexington. Back in 2010, at that time, we had a $52 million deferred maintenance problem. Parks and Rec had equipment and facilities that had fallen into disrepair, and we had kicked the can down the line, and the bill had grown to 52 million. And we were trying to figure out, how do we solve this? How do we fix this? Well, at the exact same time we had that problem, we looked over into another fund, our sanitation fund, and it had $60 million of surplus. Now, this is a special fund that had its own tax rate, and it was spending money every year on new trucks and new equipment and all kinds of things, but yet they still had $60 million in surplus even with that. Now, you have to ask yourself, what would you do if you were me? What would you do if you were a local elected official responsible for the government and services provided to the community? And in one area, you had a $52 million deferred maintenance bill, but in another area, you had a $60 million surplus. The problem was that sanitation fund had its own rules. You couldn't touch it. You couldn't affect it. Literally, the voters had to change that. You couldn't do that. But it didn't stop you from being frustrated because you saw that we could take 52 million out of that surplus, meet every need we've got in Parks and Rec, and there would still be $8 million of surplus in our sanitation fund. Super frustrating. So, what are your local officials going to think when they're running deficits in their year-to-year budgets, and they start thinking, "Oh my gosh, we're going to have to raise taxes, and that's going to affect my reelection potentially"? They're going to start to look over and say, "Wait a minute. Here's the library. They've got their own fund. They've got their own tax rate, and yeah, they stay within their budget, but they provide this menu of services. I'm not even sure what they offer over there. I've never bothered to find out. And wait a minute, they've got a massive surplus. They've got millions of dollars sitting in their rainy day fund. And they tell me that that's for a future date somewhere down the road to build a future building that they don't even really know what that looks like right now. And they just want to do that with no debt because they're financially responsible. Well, what they're going to think is, how do I lower that compensating rate? Because obviously they don't need all that money. And two, how could I get my hands on some of that money that's just sitting in their rainy day fund to fix some of my immediate problems? Now, granted, that's massively unfair to you, massively, but that's what they are thinking. When they are dealing with year to year short sightedness, have to supply all these needs by law. And over here is a fund that seems to have money coming out of its ears. I don't even really know what they do. They're going to start to look at how do they affect that, get a hold of that. The last question you ask yourself when it comes to perspective is just who makes the money decisions? Who's making the money decisions? Obviously, in the library, it's the director and the board, but over in local government, who's really in charge of that decision? Not just executive and legislative branch folks, but who are the people and the personality behind those offices? You know, does the person holding office have a background in money management? Do they understand fiscal responsibility? Do they run their own business, or do they come from a place where they just have kind of a rudimentary understanding of money? The less they understand about money individually, and in their own background, is how much it's probably going to cause you great frustration on the other side. So perspective really matters. And these are the perspective questions you need to be digging into. So where do you go from here? What can you do following this session? Well, there are 3 action steps. First, I want you to go back and answer all of the perspective questions. I really want you to go into these spaces, take time with it, slow this recording down, pause it where you need to, and answer these questions. Second, I want you to start to translate your money into their language. Translation really matters. If you go see a foreign film and it has no subtitles, you're going to miss out on a lot. So you've got to create the translation. Your money, your budgets, how you view money has to be translated into the categories and numbers that matter to them. And a few of those categories and numbers are workforce development, jobs, internet connectivity, literacy, families, election and reelection, and quality of life. These are some of the areas that really matter to your local government. So you have to start to translate what you do and how you view money into solves for them for their year to year problem. But then I would have you go one step further, and you've got to be able to articulate specifically how your money, your library's resources help them in the future. Take pressure off of that local government from a fiscal standpoint. Specifically, you want to look at everything on your side of the ledger and translate it over to their side of the ledger. How does your compensating rate being set at what it is right now, or the fact you've never raised it and or haven't raised it in a long time, or you work within that compensating rate, how does that help the government going forward? How does staying within your budget help them? Your menu of services to the community, how does that take pressure off of them? Where are some of those services and programs you offer that the government doesn't have to, and how does that translate to money for them? How does the fact that you do have a surplus and do have money and don't need to borrow, how does that help the government later on? And how does looking forward past just a year to year to future opportunities and infrastructure, how does that help them? Those are the questions you've got to be able to ask yourself and answer, and then be able to translate in their language, but with specific and clear and concise articulation. When you understand money and the difference in how people see it, when the library is seen as understanding that, you are so relevant. Irrelevance goes away. And that's the game. We want you to be the most relevant players. So here's to you having the right perspectives on money today and going forward.